Hello everybody, this is Dr. Christopher White and welcome back for part 2 of Mesozoic Life History part 1. So we've done the marine invertebrates and the marine phytoplankton, so now we're going to move on to the land plants. So at the end of the Paleozoic we had two groups of plants. So we had the seedless vascular plants, which if you remember are a group of plants that produce spores. Those spores will then go to form gametophytes, and gametophytes will then go to form a type of plant called a sporophyte, which is the adult plant. Now you'll also remember that seedless vascular plants of course need to live in areas which are quite wet because they require water as the medium through which the male sex cells will move from one gametophyte to another. Now, the other group of plants are the gymnosperms, and these are commonly referred to as the seed-producing ferns. So, these organisms, of course, have male and female cones. The male cone will release pollen, which hopefully will fall onto a female cone. The male sex cell will then fertilize the female sex cell, which will produce a seed, which will fall to the ground and grow to form an adult plant. Now, because the pollen has a waxy coating and because the seed is such a robust structure, gymnosperms do not need to exist in very wet climates. So they can exist in a whole range of different conditions. Now, both the seedless vascular plants and the gymnosperms are both going to make it through the Permo-Trias mass extinction, and so they're going to continue into the Triassic and the Jurassic, and they're going to do very, very well. Although when we move into the Cretaceous, they are going to start decreasing in abundance quite significantly. Now, gymnosperms actually begin their retreat in the late Triassic. So in terms of gymnosperms, the Jurassic is a period of, on the whole, decline. Now, when it comes to the gymnosperms, three groups of them have managed to make it from the Mesozoic and to the present day. So these three groups are the ginkgos, and that's a tree-like organism which is currently limited to areas of China, and most species died out about 2.5 million years ago at the start of the last ice age. The other group, and arguably the best known of the gymnosperms, are the conifers. Of course, as we know, these are a group of trees which are specially designed to live in higher latitude conditions, so you tend to find them in colder areas which tend to have quite poor soils, and so they tend to be limited to areas like the northern states of the US, Canada, northern Europe and Russia, and other northern Asian countries. The final group are the cycads. So the cycads, they look like ferns, they look like palm trees, but they're not. They're a group all of their own, and they first make their appearance in the Triassic. And the classic example of a cycad is a sago palm. Now, the thing about all of these groups of organisms that are left are they tend to be able to exist in relatively tricky conditions. So ginkgos, conifers and cycads can all live in areas where other plants typically can't live easily, and so this is how they've managed to make it through to the present day. So what we see is in the Mesozoic, especially after the Triassic, we start to see gymnosperms being outcompeted, and so they are forced into these more marginal areas where conditions aren't quite as good, and over time they've managed to evolve to actually thrive in those areas. So the question then becomes is, well, what's actually causing the problem? Well, the problem is that in the late Jurassic to early Cretaceous, something makes an appearance, and that something are the first flowering plants, the Angiosperms. Now, the Angiosperms very quickly begin to outcompete both the seedless vascular plants and the gymnosperms. So the situation was made worse for the seedless vascular plant and the gymnosperms by the breakup of Pangaea and the resulting changes in climate and the inundation of low-lying lagoonal boggy areas by transgressive seas. So as Pangaea breaks up, of course, this has very significant implications for ocean circulation and air circulation. So areas which were once dry suddenly become wet, and areas which were once wet suddenly become dry. And so this change in the environment isn't particularly good for either the seedless vascular plant or the gymnosperms. The other situation is that areas of coastline which were low-lying and relatively boggy, so quite wet, so perfect kind of environment for the seedless vascular plants, suddenly find themselves being inundated by these transgressive seas that appear in the Cretaceous, especially when the sea level rise, where a very big sea level rise occurs. And so this means the environments available for the gymnosperms and the seedless vascular plants decline, and so obviously so do their numbers. And then you know, just at the same time, the angiosperms start their rise, and you can see how it's going to go badly for the gymnosperms and the seedless vascular plants. Now, the fossil record for the early angiosperms is poor because, of course, we're dealing with a soft-bodied organism which isn't going to readily fossilize. However, a combination from genetic and physiological studies of plants, combined with the few fossils that we do have, suggest that they're actually descended from gymnosperms. And this would make sense because, of course, flowering plants produce seeds which they put inside fruit, and of course gymnosperms also produce seeds, so there's a very superficial connection right from the start. So we have several Cretaceous flower specimens which have been found encased in amber from Myanmar, and so this has actually been a very productive area for the discovery of Cretaceous angiosperms. So this particular specimen is arguably considered to be the best example we have to date. Now, you'll have to excuse my pronunciation, this one. So this is Cretaceous burmagensis. And it contains, so this particular sample here contains 18 complete flowers. And the flowers themselves are 5 to 8 millimeters in size, so they're pretty small. Now you can actually look and you can see the flowers here, so you can see the individual petals, and you can see the central portion of the flower, which is obviously going to contain the stamens, for instance, and the ovules. Now, the great thing about this particular plant is one of the flowers actually has these attached to it, and these are pollen grains. So, of course, these contain the male sex cells, and you can actually see the tubes which have developed from these pollen grains to allow them to get into the ovules. So, essentially, the male sex cell will have passed along these tubes inside the ovule, and hopefully it will have they would have successfully fertilized one of the female sex cells, and that obviously would have led to the growth of a fruit. So we can see already that the reproductive process of the angiosperms is actually surprisingly similar to that of the gymnosperms. So this is exactly the same kind of process that the gymnosperms have. Now, the mechanisms involved in getting the pollen from one location to another are obviously different. So in the case of the gymnosperms, they rely on the wind to distribute the pollen over the surrounding area. The angiosperms, on the other hand, use their flowers. So the angiosperms have diversified and adapted to nearly every terrestrial environment. So there are even 2 species of them that can survive in Antarctica. So they're a very hardy group. Now, the angiosperms account for approximately 90% of all land plants, with the remaining 10% being dominated by the seedless vascular plants and the gymnosperms. Now, the angiosperms have developed several features that account for their pretty spectacular success. So the first one are the seeds. So angiosperm seeds are enclosed in their own very rugged shell. So a bit like gymnosperm seeds, but on a little bit more robust actually. And of course this means they can be transported for lengthy periods of time, and it also means they can survive for periods of time in environments where there's no rainfall either. So they can just sit there in a dormant state, wait for the conditions to become correct, so wait for there to be a rain shower for instance, and at that point they can germinate. Now, another great step forward that angiosperms have is the production of fruit, and fruit is an absolutely brilliant way to distribute seeds. So the entire point of a fruit is that it will tempt an animal to eat it. And so, of course, the animal is going to eat the fruit, but the animal's obviously going to digest the parts of the fruit that it can. But one of the parts of the fruit that it cannot digest are the seeds. So the seeds are going to pass through the animal, and obviously the animal is going to get rid of them in their feces. So this means that, in between eating the fruit and the animal pooping the seeds out, they could walk for miles, tens of miles. And then obviously they'll dump the seeds in the feces, and so this means your seeds have now been distributed miles from where they started, and to make it even better, your seeds are now sitting in their own source of fertilizer. So it's an absolutely brilliant idea. Now, the main advantage that angiosperms have though are flowers. So flowers are designed to attract pollinators. Now most pollinators are insects, but not all of them. Now the way they attract pollinators is through the use of nectar, so that's essentially a sweet sugary liquid, through scent, so the flowers smell nice, or through colour, so there's some, they stand out, so that'll help to attract the insects to them. Now, the pollinators will transport pollen, which is the male sex cell, from one flower to another, and hopefully some of that pollen will be transported to a new flower, where some of it will rub off onto the new flower, and those male sex cells will then go to fertilise the female sex cells, producing a seed. So the basic process is relatively straightforward. So in your flower, you're going to have two portions in the middle of it. So you're going to have the stamens, and they're going to produce the pollen, the male sex cells. And then you're going to have the pistil, and this contains the ovule. So that's the location for the female sex cells. So what's going to happen is a pollinator is going to land on the flower. It's going to rub against the stamen, and some of the male sex cells are going to rub off onto the body of the pollinator. That pollinator is then going to fly to a new flower. When it lands on that flower, it's going to rub off some of the pollen from the first flower onto the pistil of the second flower. So that means the male sex cells are now on here. They're going to obviously produce the tubes, which we saw in this image here, and that's going to allow the male sex cell to exit the pollen, enter the pistil, and reach the female sex cells in the ovule. Now obviously once fertilization takes place, it's going to develop into an embryonic plant, which is obviously going to develop into a seed. The seed will then be dropped, it'll grow into a seedling, and then develop into a mature plant. Now this particular technique is brilliant because it's working by essentially tempting the pollinator in. So the sugary liquid essentially is a reward for the pollinator landing on the flower, or the colour or the scent help to attract the pollinators to the flower as well. So there's something about the flower that just naturally makes the pollinators want to go to it. Now the great thing about pollinators is they will often cover very, very large distances. So a flying pollinator like a honeybee will typically travel several miles in one day, and it will visit literally dozens, maybe even 100 or so flowers in a day. That's a bit excessive maybe, but it might visit a dozen or so flowers in a day. Now during these trips they will stop at these numerous flowers, which will give them plenty of opportunity to have pollen rubbed onto their bodies, or to have the pollen rub off their bodies onto the flower. And this means that there's a lot of exchange of genetic information in the area. So because there's this exchange of genetic information, and so you're having plants exchanging genetic information that may not be very near each other, because of course remember this is a flying pollinator, it can cover a very, very large distance. This means you have a significant amount of genetic exchange, and because you have such large amounts of genetic variation, of course this gives your group a lot of genetic strength. So there's a lot of capacity in the genetic makeup of the particular group of plants to allow them to adapt to new conditions, because remember, the more variants you have, the more robust the evolutionary process will be, because one of those variants will hopefully have the perfect design to thrive in that particular environment. So because you have such large amounts of genetic exchange between the angiosperms, it means they have a very, very robust genetic lineage. It means they have the capacity to evolve very, very quickly as conditions change, and this is obviously going to make them a very, very successful group of organisms. Now the other thing the angiosperms have, which the seedless vascular plants and the gymnosperms don't have in quite the same degree, is the ability to grow quickly. Angiosperms grow fast. And so obviously this means, if you're a gymnosperm and you grow slowly, what's going to happen is the angiosperms are going to grow faster, they're going to grow taller, they're going to grow over the top of you, and they're going to steal most of the sunlight, and that's going to really slow down your growth, or it's going to kill you. And so this is another reason why the angiosperms are just so extraordinarily successful, and why they manage to outcompete the seedless vascular plants and the gymnosperms so fast. So now we need to start thinking about the vertebrates. So we're going to begin with the aquatic and semi-aquatic vertebrates. So let's have a quick review of the Paleozoic vertebrates. So of course fish make their first appearance in the Cambrian, but of course these very early fish are going to be fish that have notochords rather than true spinal columns. So we don't really see, fish with spinal columns making their appearance until the late Cambrian. Now, in terms of what we refer to as modern fish, fish that have bony skeletons, we don't see those appearing really until the Devonian. So we see amphibians appear in the Devonian, and of course amphibians evolved from a class of fish which we call the lobe-finned fish, and the amphibians are going to reach their peak in the Carboniferous. Now, in the Carboniferous, we are also going to see the amphibians evolving into the reptiles, and we're going to see the reptiles very quickly diversifying and becoming very, very important in the Permian. So, of course, if you remember from the previous discussion of Paleozoic life, the amphibians are rather limited in how far they can actually go. They typically need to stay near a source of water for a couple of reasons. The first one, of course, is they need water to reproduce. And the second one is that amphibians don't really have the capacity to retain water, so they have to cover themselves in a layer of slime to stop themselves from drying out. And of course, this layer of slime needs to be constantly replenished, and that takes up quite a lot of water. So they obviously need to be near a source of water as well, so they don't dry out. When it comes to reptiles, on the other hand, well, reptiles get around the problem of having to stay near water through the development of the amniote egg, which essentially, a good example would be a chicken egg. And they also develop a strong leathery skin, which essentially stops them from drying out. And of course, this gets round the need for a slime layer, and it also gets round the need to be near water in order to successfully reproduce. And so this means all of a sudden reptiles are no longer limited in where they can go, and so they can push out into the wider continental environment. So let's think about the bony fish. So the bony fish appear in the Devonian, and they're split into two groups. So the Rayfinned fish and the lobe-finned fish, of which, of course, in terms of the lobe-finned fish, we have the lungfish, from which we evolve eventually, and the coelacanths. And of course, here's a lungfish in the background there. Now, in terms of the Rayfinned fish, they continue to evolve throughout the Mesozoic. Now, the primitive Rayfinned fish, which are the fish we have in the Paleozoic, have skeletons which are dominantly made from cartilage. However, by the Mesozoic, we have an intermediate group that has a skeleton which is made from a mixture of both cartilage and bone. Now, we also see changes in tail morphology, and essentially this takes us from the asymmetrical tail of the primitive Rayfinned fish to a more symmetrical tail. So if we look down here, we can see a picture of a relatively early Rayfinned fish, and you can see the tail is asymmetrical. So you can see the top portion has this very, very distinct swept back appearance. It's also larger. And this is a trait you see in some animals like sharks, for instance, which are a group of cartilaginous fish. Now, what we begin to see as we move into the Mesozoic and we start to see the appearance of this intermediate group, we see obviously the skeleton having less cartilage and more bone, and we see the tail becoming more symmetrical. So we see this lower portion here essentially becoming less swept back and similar in dimensions to the lower portion. Now, by the Cretaceous, the most advanced group of fish, the Teleosts, have arrived. Now, this is a group of fish that has no cartilage in their skeleton, and they have a fully symmetrical tail. They also have a reduced number of bones in their skeleton and improved jaw design, so they can, eat a wider range of materials. Their general design is simpler. The bony skeleton is more robust on the whole, and the symmetrical tail just makes it a little bit easier to power themselves through the water. So essentially they have pretty much the best design a fish can have. And of course, because they have the best design, they're going to have the evolutionary advantage, and so we're very going to quickly see the Teleosts become the largest class of the Rayfinned fish, and they will adapt to both the fresh and saltwater environments, and they're now the most numerous of all the vertebrate animals on planet Earth. So while the Rayfinned fish were getting rid of the cartilage, so the cartilaginous fish, so that's the sharks and the rays, were becoming far more numerous in the Mesozoic, although their numbers never make it anywhere near those of the Rayfinned fish. Now, the reason they are doing so well in the Mesozoic is because you have all these abundant reef habitats in these warm, shallow seas, which are absolutely stuffed with life, and so that means there's a ready food source for our cartilaginous fish, so they can thrive. They can have quite a large population size. So they remain important predators even now. Although some types of shark have actually designed to strain plankton from seawater. So you do have a few filter feeding sharks like the basking shark. So in most cases, the cartilaginous fish have actually managed to retain their position as apex marine predators, mostly in warm marine environments. Now, in the late Paleozoic, the continental vertebrates were dominated by the amphibians, with reptiles in the minority, although as we've discussed, the amphibians begin to decrease in abundance as we move from the Carboniferous into the Permian, and the reptiles begin to increase in importance as we move into the Permian. Now, the Permo-Trias mass extinction did absolutely massive damage to the class Amphibia, so it had a very serious effect on the amphibians, and especially one group called the Labyrinthodonts, so we can see a picture of a labyrinthodont in the background there, and they were nearly completely destroyed by the end of the Triassic. So essentially these very, very large amphibians, they took a very, very bad hit in the Permo-Trias mass extinction. On the other side, as we move into the Mesozoic, the reptiles very quickly start to outcompete them. The amphibians just can't, put up much of a fight, and so we begin to see the large amphibians, at least, dying out and becoming extinct. So this means that the amphibians that were left were, on the whole, quite small, and they begin to diverge in the late Permian to early Triassic. So as we move into the Triassic, the large amphibians are out, and essentially we have much smaller amphibians, the kind of animals we're used to now. So the divergence of the amphibians produces three distinct groups. So there's the Anoria, so that's the group that includes frogs and toads. There's the Chordata, so that's the salamanders and the newts. And then there's the Gymnophonia, so those are worm-like amphibians, so they are legless amphibians, and you can actually see a picture of one in the background here. Now, the fossil record for these smaller late Permian to early Mesozoic amphibians is pretty terrible, because these are relatively small animals, they have relatively fragile skeletons, and so they don't tend to fossilize that well. Now, there is actually one particularly interesting example, and it actually comes from Texas, and it's an organism called frogmander. And as the name suggests, it's an intermediate species between the frogs, so the Anoria, and the salamanders, the Chordata. So frogmander is a early to middle Permian intermediate between the Anoria and the Chordata, and it represents the stage before a clear separation. So this is one of the organisms that shows us when this separation was occurring. So the fact that we can see we have this hybrid organism in the early to middle Permian tells us that the split hasn't fully occurred yet. And so this tells us that, we aren't really going to have divergence completely between the Anoria and the Chordata until the late Permian. Okay, so now let's move on to the reptiles. So reptiles, birds and mammals are collectively referred to as amniotes because they produce amniote eggs. We also evolved from a common ancestor, with the first split, this is the reptiles turning into the mammals, occurring in the Carboniferous. So if you remember, as we're moving into the Carboniferous and the Permian, we start to see the appearance of these reptiles which have mammalian traits. So our ancient ancestors, which are a group of organisms called the protothyrids, split in the early to middle Carboniferous, and they produced two distinct evolutionary paths. So the first path are the plesiosaurs, so that's the fin-back dinosaur, the fin-back reptiles, should I say. Though I've used the word dinosaurs there totally incorrectly, so ignore that, replace that with the word reptiles. And these evolved into a group called the therapsids, and of course these are then going to evolve into the mammals. The other group we have are the thecodonts, And this is a group of reptiles that are going to evolve into dinosaurs, crocodiles and birds. So if we look at the timing, here we are in the Carboniferous. So here's the stem reptile, our common ancestor, and we can see we have our split occurring here. So we're going off one way down here. This is going to take us towards the plesiosaurs and the thrapsids. So it's going to be this line along here, whilst the other line is going to take us towards the thecodonts, and of course they're going to then separate into the snakes, the lizards, the ichthyosaurs, the plesiosaurs, the dinosaurs, who will eventually give rise to the birds, the pterosaurs and the crocodilians, and of course the turtles. Can't forget the turtles. So you can see, you know, this main split is occurring here right in the middle Carboniferous. So one of the things we need to understand is, why are dinosaurs considered special? So although they are reptiles, dinosaurs possess several traits that set them apart from other reptiles. So one of the first traits are the teeth. So the teeth of dinosaurs were in individual sockets, which is a trait they share with crocodiles, which, you know, shows their genetic links. Now, the teeth of other reptiles either just sit on the jaw or in very shallow depressions. Now, this means they can be pulled out quite easily. Now, that does, however, mean, though, that they can also be replaced quite easily. So you have to bear that in mind. But this, you know, more strongly anchored tooth design that dinosaurs have is obviously going to be an advantage, because the better anchored your tooth is, essentially the more rough you can be with it. So you can bite down on something really hard, you can rip off the flesh, and you can be relatively confident that your teeth aren't going to get damaged in the process. At the same time, if you're a herbivore, if you have, you know, teeth which are nice and well attached to the jaw, it also means you can, you know, you can work with foods which are far more robust. So when it comes to dinosaurs, we also see a reduction in the fibula. So that's a lower leg bone. We notice it's noticeably finer than the tibia, and the tibia takes the majority of the load. Now, I'm going to be honest, I don't know whether that offers any kind of evolutionary advantage. It's just one of these things that we see that dinosaurs have. So in terms of the pelvis design, we also see that the dinosaur pelvis is anchored to the vertebral column, so that's the spine, by 3 or more vertebrae. So other reptile pelvises are only anchored by 2 vertebrae. So by anchoring to 3 or more vertebrae, it essentially means your pelvis is better attached to your spinal column. It gives your body more strength. Your body is more robust. It also means your body can therefore be larger. And so this is obviously going to be a very helpful thing to have, especially, you know, when you consider the size that dinosaurs managed to reach. So in terms of the leg design, so we're back to the femur. So dinosaur femurs, which are the upper leg bone, like ours, have a ball-like head at the top, which slots into a socket in the pelvis. In fact, it's called a ball and socket joint. In other reptiles, the bone simply slots into the pelvis without the ball-like head. So I'm just going to jump to the next slide for this one. So here we go. So here we have the leg bones, the femurs, from the 2 major dinosaur groups. And what you'll notice is, like a human femur, essentially you can see the femur is upright, and then at the top here, coming out at approximately 90 degrees, we have the ball. Okay? And the ball is going to lock into the pelvis like so. Now this means the legs are going to be positioned pretty much directly below the body of the dinosaur or the mammal. And this is going to be great when it comes to supporting the animal's weight. Now, other reptiles, on the other hand, so think of something like a crocodile or a lizard, their femurs, as you can see, come along here, and the ball is just simply located at the end of the femur. So it's not coming out at 90 degrees like the bones we can see here, it's just directly at the top. And this means that the femur simply slots directly into the pelvis, almost at 90 degrees to the body. And this means that a lot of reptiles, so crocodiles, lizards, etc., have this what's referred to as sprawling gait, where the limbs literally stick straight out of the side. Now, this isn't great for being able to support the animal's weight, and it also means it can't move anywhere near as quickly. And so obviously, when it comes to being able to move fast, on the whole, that's an evolutionary advantage. You can get away from predators more efficiently, you can hunt your prey more efficiently, and therefore the chances of your success are higher. And so this shift from this sprawling gait to an erect gait is a significant evolutionary step. So other changes we also see changes with the palate bones. So the palate bones are the bones that make up the roof of the mouth. Now, the palate bones we see for dinosaurs are more elongate than other reptiles. We also see the palates are also made of more robust plates. So essentially what we're seeing here is we're seeing that dinosaurs are developing essentially a stronger mouth structure. And this ties back to the tooth design. They're essentially producing a skull and mouth that's just more robust. And of course this means they can deal with harder material. It means they can deal with harder plant matter. And it also means in terms of being a predator, obviously having a robust skull is essential because, you're going to be killing your prey typically by biting down on it. So you're going to need a very, very well built skeletal structure to do that successfully. Now, going back to the femurs, we also have dinosaurs developing this very upright posture. So the limbs of the dinosaurs are going to be located under their body rather than sprawling or semi-sprawling. So that means sticking out the side. And of course this posture requires the aforementioned ball and socket joints of the femurs, and as we've discussed, it's an evolutionary advantage because once you bring the legs under the body, it makes it easier to support the body's weight, and it typically means you can move faster, so you can get away from animals that are trying to eat you, or you can get to the animals you are trying to eat. Okay everybody, so this is a good place to stop part 2, so get up, have a walk around, get a glass of water, sit down for 5 and 10 minutes, relax, and then please come back for part 3.